The result, however, was that the summary was incorrect. And the person who was targeted in that summary is suing the journalist for libel. So it's going to become more problematic than not. And the people who don't know how to use it, people who are reckless, are going to land up with egg on their face. It reminds me of...
All right, we're live. Welcome to another episode of Life Sciences 360. My guest today on the show is Darshan Kulkarni. He is a life sciences attorney, entrepreneur, educator, and speaker, and consults life science clients and many other industry organizations under his firm, Kulkarni Law Firm. Welcome to the show, Darshan.
Thank you for having me, Harsh.
Yeah, I've tried. Usually I look at people's profile and I do research and they pick one lane and you sort of are doing a lot of interesting things and I can't imagine how busy you are. So thanks for taking time to come on the show. First question I want to ask you right out of the gate is, growing up, whenever you were in college or school or thinking about your career, did you always think that you wanted to end up into like the legal side of things, or in whatever you're doing today? Was it planned, or were there a turn of events in your career that led to where you are today?
I think there's a saying that says humans plan and God laughs.
Yeah.
So I think it's one of those situations where I thought that I would be in the manufacturing world. I thought that I would be running a pharmaceutical company because my father owned a pharmaceutical company, his father owned a pharmaceutical company. And generations before that, we owned pharmacies. So I've always been in the life sciences industry. I thought I would be more in those directions. However, there have been other ways. To me, the key was always influencing and impacting how we take care of people. And that's why I knew that I would land up having the education that I did. For those people who aren't aware, who haven't seen my LinkedIn, and to the extent you missed Harsh's discussion a little bit earlier, I have a doctorate in pharmacy. I have a master's in quality assurance and regulatory affairs. I'm an attorney. I also have a fellowship in interprofessional geriatric care, and I did a clerkship from the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. So I did all of those because all businesses, it doesn't matter what business it is, it runs off of three major legs: the technical aspects of the business, the legal aspects of the business, and the business aspects of the business. I have the technical down with my doctorate in pharmacy. I have the legal down with my JD. Business aspects, I've done business work since I was probably about 15, everything from final accounting to the like. And then I realized that my education really made me more of a clinician than a person in the pharma industry. So I went back, got a master's in quality assurance regulatory affairs. I originally thought I would use all of that to be in manufacturing, which is great. I help clients in manufacturing even today, which is great. But I found that there are other ways to do that. Software is one, services is another. So that's how I get, and then teaching is a third. So I do all of those.
So yeah, I did. Thanks for bringing up teaching. So I did see on your profile that you're teaching at Drexel Law School right now.
I teach in Drexel School of Law in their Masters in Jurisprudence program. I also used to teach till last year at the University of the Sciences, formerly called the Philadelphia College of Pharmacy. I taught in their biomedical writing program for 10-something years.
USIP, University of Sciences in Philly? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that got merged into St. Joe's recently. So the school itself doesn't exist in the same way anymore. But I was excited to do that. And I've taught at numerous other universities, everything from Temple Pharmacy to Jefferson Medical School to, I think, nursing schools and law schools and blah, blah, blah. So there have been a few.
So how, I have to ask you this, right? Like with, I know there's obviously a lot of conversations going on social media about ChatGPT and its role in education, or just even teaching in general, and how it is done today versus how when I went into master's program, or even I went to school in India. So even in some cases, the concept of having a calculator in a math class was not considered fair.
Right.
And now you're talking about sophisticated tools like ChatGPT. So how, from when you were back in school and now that you are an educator, what have you seen? How has the education system sort of changed? Have you noticed any takeaways?
So I went to schools just like you did in India. So I actually was using things like log tables and anti-log tables. And I don't know if you remember that. I still have PTSD from some of those conversations and trying to remember how to use those. But I have always been a believer that you use the tools that you have, not the tools that people like to theoretically think you don't have. I remember teachers in school telling us, oh, you'll never have a calculator by your side. And I go, I'm never going to have a log table by my side either. I'm more likely to have a calculator than have a log table by my side. So from that perspective, I'm a huge fan of using tools in ways that are unexpected. For example, I've actually conducted classes where my students would meet me and we'd do Twitter chats. So the idea was that I would talk about an issue, the students would interact with the conversation. But I had about 6,000 people following me on Twitter at that time. And you'd get these world leaders responding to the conversation. So they weren't just learning from me, they were learning from these world leaders who disagree with me, which is exactly where you want to be.
Right. You
don't want to be learning in a sterile environment. You want to be learning, you want to get your basics down, but then be comfortable having a conversation in a place where people haven't fully thought out those ideas. And that conversation leads to wonderful educational experiences. I have students right now who, this past semester, we've all been trying to figure out how AI is going to work. And I know teachers who are saying, I refuse to let you use AI. And I go, first of all, I don't really believe the hype around you can catch the AI write-ups. I read somewhere on Reddit that, you can tell when something's an AI write-up versus when it isn't. And I'm going, no, you can't. I can't tell. The only real difference lands up being, for me at least, the idea that, number one, AI seems to make up information, which is not true. And number two, the AI information for the most part so far has been very, very generic in general. Something like a 10th grader would write. And I would expect someone who knows what they're talking about to have better understanding, of better write-up. So that to me is the big difference and the distinction. However, I think overall, I encourage my students to use AI right now. I wonder if it'll change in the future. I want to make sure that they take something from the experience. But unless there's an overriding reason, I don't want to take away the tools they will more likely than not use when they actually are in a working environment, because my students are all professionals for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. So AI is, from where I can see it, it's a great tool for brainstorming or ideation. If you're just going to use it as a mechanism for putting in something and copy pasting the output, that's not a smart way to use AI. But if you're a writer, or if you are a consultant, or if you are in a master's or PhD program, or you want to write a case study, or you want to write an essay, you can definitely use AI to come up with an outline or 20 different ideas, and then maybe a first draft, but then you have to actually put something into it, right? To make it more, like you said, otherwise, if it's just going to be generic, is somebody going to be able to tell whether you wrote it or AI wrote it? Maybe not. But then it's also doesn't have the personal touch to it, the humor, the emotion, the feeling, what makes that writing better. Otherwise, it's just all words,
Yeah. I mean, you talk about something that got raised recently, right? There were two separate cases where lawyers didn't check the work that they did. They just got AI to write out the briefs, and then the AI made up a whole bunch of citations.
Yep.
And the judges are like, we can't use this. And the lawyers are being cited, not only publicly, where it's kind of humiliating, but also, so I imagine there would be some level of these lawyers being targeted for disciplinary action as well. Additionally, I think there was also the situation of a journalist who used this AI tool to summarize an article and didn't do the research associated with it. The result, however, was that the summary was incorrect. And the person who was targeted in that summary is suing the journalist for libel. So it's going to become more problematic than not. And the people who don't know how to use it, people who are reckless, are going to land up with egg on their face. It reminds me of a couple of months ago, I want to say during COVID, one of my favorite things that came out of that was this lawyer. I apparently follow a lot of lawyer stuff, obviously, but this lawyer who attended a conference with a judge, and his face was a cat. And he's like, Judge, I can assure you I'm not a cat. He's like, I take judicial notice of this. But my point is, if you don't know how to use the tool, don't use it. First, figure out how to use the tool right before you start using it in more professional settings.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, it's going to evolve. There's already every week, every month, there's new ways. And I don't use it a lot, but I'm shocked at how good it is when you try to use it. So like one example that I can think of, which you might be able to relate a little bit, is so I had a operating agreement for my consulting business, and because it's a single member company, there's nobody else. Like I'm the owner, I review and I update whenever I want to.
Yeah.
So I was working with a lawyer, and we're talking, I don't want to go too much into detail. We're talking about stuff like, who do you want to give this to in cases like if you die or something happens to you? Like, do you have a trust? Like, how do you protect these assets? You want to change these language. So this lawyer told me like, hey, here's the 3 sections that you need to change, and they need to provide some guidance around A, B, and C. I literally took that, I put it into ChatGPT, and it gave me exact verbiage of how to put it. And I sent it back to her, and she was like, who gave you this?
Right.
She said, this is not perfect, but this is really, really good. Where did you get this from? And I told her I use ChatGPT. She's like, this is insane.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. Like lawyers use it all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I've used it to improve some of my contracts. The piece, however, there are other elements that eventually will probably get improved. But for example, I think there's an element of, let's say you put in a clause into your contract. The big issue you have is, how does that clause conflict with something else you have in the contract?
Right.
And most people aren't thinking of that. Most people are going, this is a standalone statement. And no, it's rarely a standalone statement. It can be, but have you thought through, for example, a simple thing like, I'm going to use Pennsylvania as my jurisdiction. Great. Why Pennsylvania? Well, why not? Well, have you considered the fact that your business operates out of Texas? Why would you choose Pennsylvania? Well, we choose Delaware. Well, Delaware has better corporate laws. You choose Delaware because if you're a business, it makes more sense. You might choose Delaware because they just have better judges who are more used to corporate oversight. Well, why not Wyoming? Well, Wyoming has other issues to consider, but they become advantageous as well. And you get into that with like real estate, for example, where you can have blind trusts, etc. But that's the point. I think in the end, context is key. Understanding how you're going to use the technology to bring it all together. It doesn't remove you, doesn't divorce you from understanding your own duties. It just speeds up your referencing process and helps you clean up, get some initial jump off points, which is great.
Yeah, agreed. So I saw last week on LinkedIn, or for the last 2 weeks, you've been going on a lot of events and speaking and talk shows. I think last week you were at an event talking about advertising compliance. So what is it that you do? Are you like reviewing ads that life science companies put out, or what are you doing when you say advertising compliance?
So first off, I was at 2 separate events last week, gave 4 talks last week on advertising compliance. So it was a busy week. But so let's start from the basics. As we all know, doesn't matter what you do in the life sciences, the point of a drug, device, or a biologics company is to make sure that your product meets 2 criteria and doesn't meet 2 criteria. The 2 criteria you must meet is that your product is safe and efficacious, and it is not adulterated or misbranded. So safe and efficacious is usually based on the testing you're doing, and adulterated and misbranded is really how you're going to put the product out. Drug advertising is part of the misbranding component, generally speaking. So when you're talking about misbranding, there are several different ways to get into misbranding, but the one piece that we're talking about here is the difference between label and labeling. So most people think of those 2 words as being the same exact thing, and they are not.
I thought of the same thing. I don't know the difference.
Right. Most people think label is whatever's attached to the bottle, and that's great. That's your labeling as well. No, the label is what's attached to your bottle. Labeling, according to a Supreme Court decision, is anything that accompanies the bottle. So what does that actually mean? What does the word accompany mean? So if you give a book along with your bottle, that's part of the labeling. Your sales rep talks about your drug when you give the drug to someone. That's part of the labeling. You have a drug ad that goes out. That's part of the labeling. So my job is to make sure, in that specific context, my job is to make sure that you are meeting labeling requirements as well. So what does that really look like? That can come in several different flavors. One might be, here are the FDA rules on what your advertisement can say. So it might just be a print ad, in which case you need to have what's called fair balance for certain types of products. So you don't really need fair balance in the same sense for a device as you do for a drug, but fair balance is one requirement, which means that your claims and your contraindications and the adverse events and stuff need to be appropriately balanced. You need to disclose them. That's why you see those drug ads, which say this drug can be used to cure everything, like cure athlete's foot, but here are all the problems associated with it. That's because of fair balance. On the other hand, it also extends into things like clinical trials. So for example, if you have a doctor who's going to be speaking for you, is he or she meeting your goals around fair balance? Is he a representative of the company? In that case, you're looking at FDA FTC issues. So it's not just FDA at that point. Sometimes you might be involved from a compliance, from a promotional perspective, in the area of, how should I put this, Anti-Kickback False Claims Act violations. And those have a whole bunch of areas that come under question, that come under pressure. So you might have a situation, for example, where you are telling the doctor that, you know what, we're going to do this clinical trial. We want you to be the principal investigator on it. That sounds great as a concept. But if the clinical trial involves 10 patients, this doctor is responsible for enrolling 5. And if he doesn't enroll 5, it doesn't matter. And you pay the doctor $10,000. Well, that's not really for clinical research at that point. That's just to give a payment of $10,000 to a doctor, and you're hiding it as a clinical research program. And there have been situations involved with promotional compliance that have popped up in that area. There's something called beneficiary inducements. So for example, you might have, you might go to a patient and you might tell the patient, you know what, I would love for you to use this product, bill Medicare and Medicaid, your pharmacist or your doctor will bill Medicare and Medicaid, and here's $10,000, you can be an intern at our company. Well, that might land up being problematic, and companies need to be considering that as they hire people. So all of these become issues in promotional compliance. For example, let's say you're trying to enroll a patient into your clinical trial. What can you say about your drug when you tell them that we want you to participate in this clinical trial? At what point have you gone from, we want you to be part of this clinical trial, to this drug will improve your care, will improve your disease? Is that promotional at that point? Can you say something promotional about an investigational drug, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
So when you're looking at this advertising compliance, are you strictly focused on like the US market, or have you had any clients that, let's say, are advertising in US but also in Europe? Then would you also advise them how to change the language or the labeling for like a different region?
So I'm barred in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, so I do U.S. law.
Okay.
So I stick to the U.S. law. However, I've been asked to help in issues like clinical research transparency issues, which is more of a global issue. So Europe and Canada and some of these other countries, I've been asked to advise on those. But usually 99% of the time, I'm trying to stay within the U.S.
Okay. And then another question, as you were mentioning about the labeling, that popped up in my head is, there are a lot of instances where, let's say you have, a company that is, their product is not a drug, device, or biologic. It's maybe food or nutraceuticals, and they think it's food, but it needs to meet certain requirements for drugs or biologics. So do you also advise those kind of clients to say, hey, you're telling that this is a nutraceutical or a food, but there is some components here where you need to, also follow drug regulations, because you're saying what your product actually is?
Yeah, so the difference between a food and a drug is not the product itself. It's the claims you make about the product. So if you are saying that, and there are examples of this. So for example, take fish oil. Fish oil has been available for years as a nutraceutical, but it was approved by Amrin, and also has a drug version of it. And the claims you can make as a drug approval are very different from the same claims the same product can make in the food world. Now, Amrin would probably argue that it's not the same product, because there's a different level of testing, there's a different level of manufacturing requirements that are being met. But the point being that these are deemed to be, it's not the product itself, it's the claims you make along with it. So for example, you can't make something like will reduce your risk of heart attacks by 4% as a food, but you might be able to do that as a drug. So there are structure function claims, et cetera, which depending on whether you're a drug or a device you can make versus foods.
Yeah, another example that came to mind is obviously, something like a weight loss pill, right? So that could also
Correct.
be borderline. It could be a drug or something that, hey, this will increase your metabolism or whatever, what have you, and then you will end up losing weight, but you can't really say you should use this, as a medical, statement that you will lose weight, right?
So it's a decent example that pops up often enough. So you can say something theoretically, and again, I'd have to do it would be product specific, but and just to be clear, this is not legal advice. This is just general conversations.
Yes.
But and for educational reasons only. But you might be able to say something like increased metabolism, because that doesn't really mean anything. But you say will cause weight loss, that's potentially a violation, because that's a disease claim. So anything that's used to cure, treat, prevent, mitigate a disease state would be a drug. That's the definition, according to the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act, of a drug. So are you doing any of those? If not, maybe you can get away. So you've got to be careful about what you say and what you don't say.
Interesting. Yeah, this has always been, advertising. I don't know much about this area, so I really like this last 5 or 7 minutes of your insights on this topic. I want to jump into another topic that I come across a lot in my consulting experience, which is, dealing with regulatory inspections or dealing with FDA 483s. Now, I work in mostly in software and technology compliance side of things. So I've been with companies who were preparing for a regulatory inspection. I've also worked as a consultant for companies who got a 483. But from your lens, because you're in the legal side of things, for any startup or a company that has just got their first 483, what advice do you have for them to even how do I say it, process the fact that they received a 483 before they think about responding? Because there's so many startups in the last 10 years who've come out in personalized medicine, cell and gene therapy, a lot of areas. So what is your take on that?
So I think if you have a 483 or the like, whether it's a title, untitled letter of any kind, whether it's a warning letter, the key piece is, first of all, don't just... So I think the issue of a 483 starts before the 483 is issued. You've got to start from when... 483 is not a... It's a result. It's a preventable result. So you've got to start off by going, which of these issues really needs to be addressed? How should it be addressed? So, for example, do you have a policy on how to deal with the FDA walking through your door? Number 2, what documents are you going to provide to the FDA? Not all documents need to be produced. Just because the FDA asks for it doesn't mean that you have to produce it. For example, does the FDA have any reason to look at your financial numbers? The FDA is a quality organization. Their job is to make sure that they're looking at the quality of your processes, and appropriately so. We want to make sure that patients are healthy, and you're only providing safe and efficacious products. How does me giving you my numbers, telling you how much I paid my consultants, address that question at all? So those types of issues, can they take photographs within your institution? Do you have trade secrets to worry about? For example, if I'm an FDA inspector, am I allowed to go in and take photographs in Coca-Cola and try to put together their formula of how they make things? Well, no, that would be a violation of the Trade Secrets Act. I don't care whether you're the FDA or not. So from my perspective, I'm not coming at it from a quality perspective. I'm coming at it from a legal perspective who's informed by quality. So to me, in my world, The FDA is just another player who is doing its duty to make sure that patients are being appropriately protected. And that's appropriate. But my job is to protect my client as well. And the FDA has its own lawyers to help protect them and protects people, which is great. And I think we're all collaboratively working to help protect people. But I think you need to have clear policies in place. The next question, so once you have clear policies, who's going to be in the room? So if you have a 483 that might get issued, if you have an inspection going on, do you put the chatterbox in the room while the FDA is taking its notes? No, you probably don't want the chatterbox in that room. You want someone who's going to take notes. Why? Because the FDA might ask you a question. This guy who doesn't know anything is suddenly telling things that they probably shouldn't be speaking about. So is there a spokesman? Should that spokesman be the CEO? Maybe, maybe not. Should the spokesman be the lawyer? Maybe, maybe not. Sometimes I just like someone who is well-versed in just having a conversation. That becomes a question. So you might have the actual place where you do the inspection, review the findings, and you might have a separate location where you are actually responding to the 483. And that might be, if the FDA says, give me the batch records from XYZ period, it might make sense to go, could you tell me a little bit more about what you're looking for? Sure, we're looking for this. So this way you can narrow down the scope of what you're giving to the FDA. You don't want to be in a situation where you're just giving out documents and the FDA then is looking for X, but you give them A, B, and C, and now they're looking at A, B, and C.
Yeah.
So that's just in the preparation, in the writing. The next, and you can't always prevent everything, and that's not the point of this. The point is you are responding to the FDA appropriately to the questions that they're asking you. It's important to ask the scope of what you're asking. So now the FDA has come in, they've done the inspection. Then you've got to decide how you respond to the findings of the 483. One of the key things people do is that people get worried, and they should be worried if the FDA has pointed out some flaws, but not worried so that you respond inappropriately. So you'll get people who come in and say, oh, the FDA had this problem, we're going to fix things, FDA, everything will be ready next week. Most of the people aren't here. They're on vacation, it's summer, they're at a conference. You can't do it by next week. Why are you making promises you can't keep? So what the FDA wants, and this is why the FDA, I like to say the FDA will give you enough news to hang yourself. They're not asking you, they won't tell you what to do. They will tell you what do you want to do because you know your processes. And as a result of that, they will hold you to your own promises. So look at what is a reasonable promise to make. If you're going to train a 500-person staff, you're probably not going to be able to do it by next week. 2-person staff, maybe. 3-person staff, maybe. But even that, I would go, well, how are you going to get that together? You've got to get your policies together. You've got to reconcile those policies with everything else you have. You've got to get buy-in from appropriate stakeholders. Can you do all of that within a week? And then train everyone. And then record that you've done the training associated with it. And then and that's just the corrective action. How are you going to do the preventative action? This is one of the key pieces. People seem to forget this all the time. It's CAPA. So corrective action and preventative action. FDA says you left a test tube outside the fridge. People said, and I had this happen, which is why I say this, oh, we took the test tube and put it back in the fridge. Yeah, that's a corrective action. What's the preventative action? Preventative action might be something as simple as we make sure that all test tubes that are pulled out are logged in, and then we have a system that beeps if you haven't logged it back out, if you haven't put it back in. The idea being that you need to have a clear program to make sure that you have appropriate corrective and preventative actions. But again, you're seeing this from the perspective of, well, what did the FDA actually notice? Did the FDA actually notice the syringe that's out or the test tube that's out? Is that what they're concerned about? Or did they come in because they were worried about the lack of cleanliness in your facility? And now you're talking about this test tube when they didn't even ask about that. And you're suddenly blabbing on because you're nervous about that.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely an area where there isn't like a clear-cut answer, right? In many other cases, you have sort of a blueprint of, hey, here's how you act for, let's say, whether it's clinical trials or whether it's manufacturing, GMP, GLP. But this area of dealing with an inspection, responding. There's never, you can't, I mean, yes, there are some parts that are common across all inspections, but every inspection has its own unique story because the people are different, the company is different, their history or non-existence of a history if it's a new company with the FDA. There's so many moving parts that it's hard to say do X, Y, and Z and you'll be good, because you really have to think in that moment what's the right decision, like you walk through different examples. So I myself have been nervous many a times, dealing with agency, and I'm sure many other people who are immensely talented in their jobs might unintentionally, say something that they shouldn't have said, or might make a reckless decision or a promise. Like, so it's always an area that I it's like I always lose sleep every time I hear like, oh, we have an inspection or we have this agency audit that's happening. So thanks for that.
Absolutely. I think it's also important to not just see things from the perspective of one agency. So, for example, I think you mentioned that you're looking at IT questions, right? And you might have IT findings. I come at it from the perspective of, well, what agency is looking at? Why are we worried? For example, you might be thinking about Part 11 compliance because
Correct.
that's what the FDA is thinking about.
Yep.
But the fact is that Part 11 compliance is just the FDA. If you're talking about patient privacy, which is the case in a lot of like clinical trial documentation, now at that point, you're thinking of OCR, Office of Civil Rights, because they're looking at HIPAA. Well, you've got HIPAA going on, you've got Part 11 compliance going on. There's also the FTC that is looking at the question of privacy. Then you've got state laws, you've got CCPA, BDPA, you've got all these different states with their own version, their own flavor. And then if you start going international, you've got GDPR. How does all of this reconcile in a way that makes sense for your company? There was a recent law, I want to say Montana, but I could be wrong. One of the states came out recently and they said, we're trying to fill in the gaps between what all these different states are saying. So we want to go after things that everyone else is missing. So there will have to eventually be some level of reconciliation because there are so many different versions of this. But I've had sponsors, I've had pharmaceutical companies, I've had medical device companies take the position that we're not subject to HIPAA. Well, here's a really easy question for you. Why are you not subject to HIPAA? Well, because we don't collect patient data. So you don't collect patient data, but do you own that patient's data? Oh, yes, we own the patient's data. So you own data you don't collect?
Yeah.
So how does that work? So these are the conversations you get into.
What do you, so this is something I don't ask people a lot, and I should, because every person has a really amazing answer for this. What do you love about your role, like, working with companies, working with clients, and what is kind of one thing that you don't like, that you someday wake up and think, why did I choose this career?
I think I'm very, very lucky. I grew up in a time when I thought that, I spent the first 20 years as a clinician. I help patients every single day. I've been in a situation where I think it was like $12 and 12 medications, and each medication costs $12. Which medication should I take? And that was horrible as a pharmacist, to have to choose what is right for the patient. I'm lucky in that I think the industry makes an effort to say, you know what, if you can't afford the medication, reach out to us. We have programs that'll help you. So I think that the intention of the industry is good, and I'm lucky to be part of that. I think there are downsides to that. For example, I think people do get greedy. I think the cost of drugs is incredibly high, and pretending otherwise is silly. I'm not getting into the value of the drugs, but I'm talking about the cost. And I think that there are efforts being made to address that. And there are lawsuits going on to those efforts being made to address that. I think, who was it? I can't remember. There are two drug companies right now suing CMS for its efforts right now. So those would be the parts I feel lucky about. I think from an entrepreneurial perspective, I think one of the best parts about doing what I do is you have some really big highs and really low lows. And,
Agreed. Yeah.
And those are scary. I think, Harsh, you actually had a post yesterday or the day before where you talked about in April, you were going, why am I doing this? And today you signed a contract with a large pharma company, a top 20 pharma company. And that makes me kind of go, yeah, that's my experience. Like, you're going, what am I doing? every time a new client signs, you're excited. Every time that client leaves, you're terrified, and that cycle just keeps repeating.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely a great industry to work in. I don't know what I would be doing otherwise if I wasn't in pharma, but you are right. There are some weeks and months where it's literally like I don't even make an effort to get new projects, or I don't even make an effort to hire people, but it suddenly feels like 7 clients want me to do 7 different things, and then all of a sudden 5 people appear that I can bring on the team. So it's like it's never planned. It's not like, oh, in July I'm going to have 3 new clients, but it just happens so fast that I almost have to be ready, because tomorrow it could, like you said, it could be either or. I could lose 5 clients next month, or there could be 5 more that come in. And it's just that thrill of sometimes, with personal, obviously I have a toddler at home. So being a father, spending time with him, and also being there for my family. My family lives in India. So challenges to, meet with them, and then running a business. It's like, I can't drop a ball, right? I have to hold all at the same time. And for me, that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, but that's the fun of it.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I have a few closing questions for you. Any book recommendations? I know you read a lot of regulations and documents from clients, but when you're not reading them, do you have any books to disconnect off of the life science stuff?
I should have thought of this question. I'm sorry. Let me look at my Audible list, because I don't read books anymore.
Oh, no worries.
I read so many books. I listen to so many books, and I read so many regulations. I avoid reading books, which is a terrible thing to admit. But let's see, what did I finish recently? So this is going to sound terrible. And I don't think it sounds that terrible. There's a book called Jaya. So if you grew up in India, you've all heard of the story of the Mahabharata, which is the story of good over evil. It's sort of like a Marvel movie, but not quite.
Yeah.
But I think that it's a great story. In about 2013, 2014, I landed up taking 2 months off and backpacking through a piece of the world. So I went through the east coast of the world. So I did Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Singapore, Australia, and someone had me fly to Berlin and give a talk there. And when I was doing that, what I discovered is that the Mahabharata, even though it originated in India as we understand it now, there are all these different stories in Vietnam and in Laos and in Thailand. It was really cool to understand that these stories have other chapters that I've never read. And I felt like Jaya brought all those stories together. So for me, that was a really interesting book. It's one of my favorite ones to read. And I try to go back to it every so often. So it starts with components I didn't even realize were part of the Mahabharata, things like Nal Damayanti and stuff, which, again, for those people who have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm sorry I've lost you. But it's kind of interesting to see them all connect together.
Interesting. Yeah, I've read, obviously, growing up in India, I read bits and pieces of it when I was in teenager and in school, but I don't remember much of it. So I don't want to. Yeah. I don't want to misspeak and offend anyone that knows Mahabharata. So, but listen, this has been really amazing conversation. I know you also host a podcast, right? Do you want to talk about that, just so if anybody wants to hear more about you or the guests that you chat with, you want to put a plug for that?
Absolutely. Thank you for letting me do that. So I host a podcast called the Darshan Talks podcast, and at this point, it's only on YouTube, and it's interviews with people who impact the life sciences, but I've been focusing more and more specifically on people who impact legal, regulatory, and compliance. So I have lawyers, I've had bioethicists, I've had CEOs, I've had regulators. There are probably about 650 interviews so far probably on there. So you might find it interesting if that is your jam.
Interesting. I've already checked out a few episodes. I think that's how I first heard about you, because you were doing a LinkedIn live stream and you were talking to somebody about AI, and I saw the notification. I started listening to it. So yeah, I've listened to a few of those. So where can people find you after this show if they want to connect with you or work with you?
So you could always find me on LinkedIn. I'm Darshan Kulkarni. I don't think there are too many of me, but there are a few.
Yeah.
I'm an attorney based in Philadelphia. You can just go to my website, kulkarnilawfirm.com, or you can find me on Twitter at Kulkarni Law Firm. And I'd love to hear from you. Or you can actually reach me. You can email me, Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com.
That's great. So any closing thoughts before we wrap this up? I love this conversation today.
This was a great conversation. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate your help. I appreciate you putting this message out, and I'm excited to see what more you have as we continue.
Yeah, thanks, Darshan.